Hello, EDUC 381 students. I wanted to create a little video for you guys to help explain the Unpacking the Standards assignment. So what I've done for you is posted this sample of the assignment, and on the sample you'll see at the bottom where I have the pacing guide, the unit calendar, and the unit map, all to help guide you as you finalize your assignment. You'll see on my pacing guide that I was using the 8th grade New Mexico Social Studies standards. I went through all the standards and I looked at the different big ideas, and I found that the 8th grade New Mexico standards are largely based around U.S. history, but then also have a government and an economics kind of unit or content, bigger content area that's going to be covered during that school year. So those three bigger content areas are pretty large, which I can then break down into what I found to be the big ideas. So within U.S. history, there's colonization of the New World to get started, followed by American Revolution, Western expansion, Civil War, and Reconstruction. All of that is covered in U.S. history. So then I just broke it down a little bit further into the additional topics covered. By doing these additional topics covered, I was able to really get in and detail what each of the individual standards were telling me about the American Revolution, because there were a lot of standards there, so I want to make sure that I cover a majority of them. Next, you can see that in my days allotted, I went through and I critically thought about how many instructional days it would take to teach colonization of the New World. And I figured it could take quite a while, so I allotted 7 days for colonization of the New World. And I think that that alone ties into a single assessment. So I thought about how we could assess colonization of the New World and thought perhaps a group project might be suitable for that assessment. So small group project would probably only take about 2 days, 1 day for putting information together and another day for presenting the projects. You can also see for American Revolution, I allotted several days for each of the individual topics, but then I showed that there might be 4 assessment days, in this case for a big project. And that big project, because of the way I organize things, I can tell is going to fit all of these topics. So there will be a big project all about the American Revolution, then just a smaller assessment that gets at the reforms during the Age of Jackson. So all of those types of things go into my decision making for each of the individual big ideas and the topics covered. I make sure that every couple of days or probably weeks, probably every couple of weeks, there's going to be some kind of an assessment happening. And at the very bottom, what you can see is that I have used the sum feature. And if you had a hard time finding the sum feature, once you click this little dot 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 to find more options, the functions button here can get you the sum. And what you have to do is just tell the spreadsheet that you're taking the sum of all of these days, and you drag your cursor up to get the sum of the days. So I have 122 instructional days and 36 assessment days set aside for this class. And that decision of how many days to use was based on what we did when we looked at the school year calendar. So that's the pacing guide. Another thing to see here is I have highlighted 1 unit on the pacing guide. The reason I highlighted this 1 unit is because that's the exact unit that's going to then be used for the next part of the project, which is the unit calendar and the unit map. So please do highlight the unit that you're going to be looking at in further detail. Next, let's look at the unit calendar. You can see here that my unit calendar I still have very organized, and things are titled and neat and tidy. And so it's still the 8th grade Social Studies standards, but this time I'm narrowing in on my unit calendar for New Mexico economy. That's what I was calling this unit. I'll be detailed over here and still show a little bit of my backwards mapping. So the bigger content strand was economics. This specific big idea is the New Mexico economy. These were the topics that I had listed. They were 1, 2, 3, 4 topics. I'm sorry, actually 1, 2, 3 topics that were listed on the pacing guide, and then I went ahead and made myself room to help describe the assessment, which is going to make up all the days allotted for this whole entire unit. So these 3 topics, you'll see if I go back to the pacing guide, were these exact 3 topics that I had written here. Right here, I had said that there was going to be 2 days for limits to New Mexico as an urban state, 2 days for relationships between New Mexico tribal and U.S. economic systems, 2 days to compare New Mexico commerce to other states. So those 2 days per little topic have to be fleshed out even further. So on this unit calendar, you want to make sure that you're showing each individual day and the topics that you're breaking it down for. So these 3 bigger topics came from the pacing guide, and now we want to actually further define the daily topics. So my daily topics, for example, of limits to New Mexico as an urban state, really needed to start with defining urban and rural states or communities, talking about impacts on the economic development for those communities, and then on the next day, starting to talk about allocation of water and other natural resources that help to create some of those limits that we're going to be exploring. So like I said, we're breaking down each individual day into its own topic. Then the assessment days. These 4 assessment days came from what I said in the pacing guide was going to be 4 days worth of a big project. So in my unit calendar, I'm showing those 4 assessment days are actually going to be for my big project, which is going to be a New Mexico lawmaking poster project. So the first day we have to assign the roles and give instructions, start to get started. The next day they will continue their research and start to create their poster. And then the next 2 days will be the presentation of those posters. So that right there makes up my unit calendar. The next thing that you need to work on is a unit map, which a unit map just further aligns what you were saying was going to happen on the unit calendar with the actual standards themselves that came from our standards document that we started with. So what you need to do for this unit map is really get into the standards themselves. When I was working on this pacing guide and I was looking at the New Mexico economy and I listed these exact topics, it's because if I switch over here really quickly to the social studies standards, these were the very last standards, you can see right here that these last 3 standards are the actual ones that I was using on my pacing guide. So when I take these exact standards and put them into my unit map, there were 3 of them. Even further detail, they were numbered 3, 4, and 5. I want to use those standards and actually map out the learning activities and materials that are going to go along with that. So I listed my standards. One thing I did to kind of back map here again, if I go back to my standards document, is that I looked at where the standards were in relation to the bigger benchmark that outlined, in this case, the patterns of trade and exchange. If I go up even further in my standards document, I can see that it was based on the strand of economics, which in this case is saying students will understand basic economic principles, blah, blah, blah. So that level of detail is what I'm going to provide here to show the entire set of standards that make up this unit. Additionally, there's a big overarching social studies skill standard that needs to be applied to every unit all year long. So I made a note of that down here to help show how my assessment not only meets these standards for economics, but my assessment also meets this overarching skills standards where students need to act as historical researchers. So lastly, I have my standards, and then I'm going to just quickly list some of the learning materials that are going to take place. So I think in a social studies class, it's fitting that research obviously takes place across all or most standards. Another item I used was selected readings. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of selected readings that are used in order to dig deeper into this standard. So I have selected readings for 2 of them. I also have primary resources because that's not only one of these problem-solving skills that students need, but primary resources is probably going to be the best way to dig into tribal, U.S., and of course New Mexico economic systems. Another piece of learning material that I thought was appropriate was a documentary on New Mexico resources. That can absolutely help to understand how New Mexico resources limit us as an urban state. I could list a couple more, but we don't need to go overboard with learning materials because remember the amount of days that we're allotting to all of this. Lastly, the activities needs to be aligned with not only the learning materials, but also the standard. So in this case, we're going to be doing some discussing over the factors we're going to research. I will probably, as the teacher, have students reflect over what they're seeing in our research and readings. And then I thought that for this standard, a quick little kind of closing activity for a single day's lesson might be to have students make predictions about New Mexico potentially becoming an urban state and the implications that that could have for the state. Other activities that I looked at for the next standard were discussion again, maybe a comparison chart, and having students propose improvements to the relationships between our economic systems. And finally, the last standard was all about comparing and contrasting. So of course we could do a discussion, but also have the students compare and contrast a few states to New Mexico. The last thing you'll see is the assessment that I described here. What you really want to make sure of when you're working on your unit map and thinking through your assessment is you need to really make sure that your assessment is aligned with the standards. This assessment has to get at these standards, and the activities that you do to build up to the assessment should have a good alignment to where we can really guarantee success of the students while they're working on this unit, and we can ensure that learning is going to happen not only through the activities, but the follow through that they will all go through. So think through all of these things critically with your groups, and then remember that you're also going to have to go back to your pacing guide, and individually you're going to need to go through and select your own units that you're going to do the same thing for. But individually, you do need to talk through this individual selection as a group because no 2 group members can do the same unit when they're doing their individual units. If you guys have any questions about any part of this assignment, please let me know. Thanks. Oh, and one last thing. Let's look at how to save all of this as a PDF that you guys can upload on Canvas for the assignment. All you need to do is go to File, Download, and select PDF. And you'll see here that it's showing the overall, the very first sheet. But if you go right here to the export, instead of current sheet, you can go to the whole workbook, and that will give you all of the pages that we worked on, all of the tabs that were at the bottom there. Then all you have to do is export, and it'll download it for you on your computer. And then you guys can just upload that on Canvas. So good luck, and of course let me know if you have questions.